Before we get going, I just want to talk a little bit about my organization, the Maine Monitor. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization based in Hollowell. We've been around for about 15 years now, but have grown really a lot in the past 5 years. I've been here for 2 years now, and we've done some really hard-hitting investigations and longer form pieces on a variety of topics, from the environment to elder care to state affairs. And we were founded to do that kind of in-depth and investigative reporting that has been increasingly cut from newsrooms, especially local newsrooms. We have no paywall. Our news is free for anyone to read on our website. We also give all of our reporting away for anyone to republish for free. So think the Press Herald or the Bangor Daily News. This is the kind of work that we think is foundational to helping people make informed decisions about their communities. And it's the reason I got involved in journalism. And on that note, so I've been thinking about sea level rise, flooding, and climate change well before I started at the Monitor. I grew up in the Chesapeake Bay. I was constantly reminded of all three. Over the past 2 decades, my hometown of Annapolis, Maryland, has experienced some of the sharpest increases in high tide flooding in the country. These instances are also called nuisance floods or sunny day floods. It's when astronomical high tides or storms combine to cause a prolonged period of inundation throughout a single day. And since I was a kid, when I was born in 1998, that might have happened on average 1 to 2 times a year. And between 2019 and 2020, the city saw 18 days of nuisance flooding or high tide flooding. That's both because of rising sea levels and also because of the unique topography of the Chesapeake Bay, which is actually sinking. So not only is the Chesapeake Bay region sinking, but the sea level around it is rising, causing this just devastating combination. So the growing threat and the rest of the Chesapeake Bay's ailments are pretty much what drove me to environmental journalism as an undergraduate at the University of Vermont. I studied environmental studies there, and at first I wanted to be some sort of environmental communicator. And then as I got involved with our school's undergraduate environmental magazine, I realized what better way to communicate environmental issues through journalism, and was able to work on some really cool long form pieces that were both descriptive of environmental issues, but also kind of explored solutions. After I graduated in 2020, I worked a few different jobs. I worked for the Forest Service as a trail crew worker in Oregon. I got thrown in to work on some wildfires that summer during a really disastrous season of wildfires out west. And when I came back home to Maryland at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021, I realized that I really wanted to pursue journalism full speed ahead. So I got my master's degree in journalism at the University of Maryland, cut my teeth reporting on environmental issues for our school state news bureau in Annapolis. And then before I came to the Monitor in 2023, I spent about 6 months working as an environmental reporter for a daily newspaper in Western Maryland. So both working at my school's outlet and then in that Western newspaper, I got to see both sides of flooding issues, from the rivers and the foothills of the Appalachians to on the coast in the Bay. Maine saw the worst of both of those types of flooding last winter. Mountain towns in Franklin County were isolated from one another because of the surging streams, and rivers were at record highs, while high tides along the coast wiped away tons of vital coastal infrastructure, wharves, roads. Any actions that state or community leaders were taking to build climate resilience before last winter of 2023-2024, have been fast-tracked, leading to an impressive patchwork of infrastructure projects and policies that I've been following for the past year and a half, really, since I started at the Monitor. Community leaders are now preparing for when the next storm will hit, not if. And I've been trying to take stock of all the options and tools available to us and municipal leaders, state leaders, at a time when federal funding promises are not guaranteed. And that's a path I'll be taking you down today. So to put modern floods and flood risk into perspective, I've been trying to ground my reporting in our region's historic inundation patterns. Oftentimes when you think of floods, you think of this chaotic, destructive force that is up for humans to control, but really in nature, they're a restorative feature. Floodplains are, think of the Mississippi Delta, are one of the most productive agricultural areas. They're this intense, biodiverse place of just new beginnings and immense power. So the price of anchoring Maine communities in a position to harness river power for the logging industry and other industries, that they'll always be flood prone. Same goes for coastal infrastructure. Floods are natural phenomena that have been historically restorative for that land, and Maine has now some of its largest communities built on those crossroads. Archaeological records show that Wabanaki communities cultivated crops like maize, squash, and beans on the fertile banks of the Kennebec River and other major rivers, but in a site specifically where Norridgewock now stands. River banks across Maine are also where brown ash has historically flourished and other hardwood forests that have vital cultural ties. And with the arrival of European settlers came the displacement of some of these more temporary agricultural settlements with more permanent hard infrastructure, like you see in Hallowell or in Augusta. So where the Kennebec was once able to exhale and release torrents of rainwater when it flooded in the spring, are now mills, dams, and other concrete structures that can easily be wiped away during the next flood. Some of the first settlements, European settlements in Maine that were built along rivers like the Androscoggin or even in the Royal River, on the Royal River down in Yarmouth. I mean, the first floods that hit them wiped away entire towns, dams included, the mills, and it's just shown that as long as you build in a floodplain, you're gonna have those effects. So historically, springtime floods of rain and snowmelt called freshets have been the most devastating in Maine because they can send just absolute walls of ice hurtling downstream like you see there. Maine has lost up to 20% of its wetlands since the 1780s, replacing areas that once were able to absorb floods with areas that are now susceptible. The worst flood to hit Maine came in 1987. It was known as the April Fool's Day flood. It had a low pressure system that came through the state and blasted the mountains kind of at a perpendicular angle against the Appalachians that caused a rapid snow melt and brought torrential downpours that set the record for precipitation and river surges. It caused more than $100 million in damage, and in some places on the Kennebec flooded over 30 feet. And then on the coast, the worst flooding came a decade earlier in 1978 when a hurricane force blizzard overlapped with astronomical high tides, sent waters record high at 9.6 feet in Portland. So these are two of the storms that up until I think last winter, really, I've heard old Mainers kind of compare current flood risk to. It's a grounding of understanding of, okay, this area flooded in 1987. That was a once in 50-year, 100-year event. The next time that happens won't be for some time. We don't have to think about that. But with climate change, sea level rise, warming oceans, and just the new unpredictability of weather and our sea, it's become clear to everyone that that understanding has changed. The old playbook has been thrown out. Sea level rise and climate change have changed the frequency, intensity of floods, and now communities are really starting to plan accordingly. So these are just a few quick hits on where we are now with climate change and where we might be at moderate and more intense projections down the line for greenhouse gas emissions. In Portland, coastal flooding has occurred about 3 times more often since 2010 compared to the average frequency of flooding the century prior. That both means with events like the January storms of last year and also sunny day flooding. Portland gets its own instances of that too. And then over that same period, Maine's experienced 8 inches of sea level rise, according to the Maine Climate Council, and projections now show that increase could reach an additional 1.5 feet by 2050. Maine is also getting wetter with more high intensity precipitation. Precipitation variability increases due to an intensified hydrological cycle, meaning that water cycles quicker through the atmosphere, land, and oceans, and comes down all at once. And in between periods of heavy rain are also periods of extreme dryness. So that unpredictability can give you a summer like we had last year, where there was intense drought, and then the year prior, where there was intense flooding. And just to put some of those extreme rain events in perspective, this is a chart detailing that for Farmington, which sits alongside the Sandy River, was extremely devastated by flooding in May of 2023 and then later that year in December. And you can see that there are more frequent rain events of 4 inches and more compared to the past century, even though precipitation amounts annual totals may stay the same. More and more rain is coming all at once, which isn't necessarily good for crops either, because if the ground isn't in a good position to absorb that wetness, then it can just flow straight into the rivers instead of kind of cycling through the ground and down to groundwater. And then this is also the same issue along the coast. Flooding risk increases as sea levels rise. So both of the events that caused the dramatic flooding inland Maine in December 2019, and then later a month after in January, were caused by southeaster storms. You may have heard of nor'easters, which are more common, but these southeasters are becoming more variable and intense with climate change. The reason why they're so flood-inducing, first starting with inland Maine, is that it's kind of like that flood I described earlier. There's just this rapid blast of warm winds blowing from the southeast, hitting mountain faces head on, causing a ton of snow to melt all at once, combined with rain, heavy precipitation, and it just creates this double whammy that inundates rivers and causes some of the highest flooding. And speaking with hydrologists with the National Weather Service after the December storm, it was clear that one of the largest issues for predicting that storm was just how rapid and how quickly snow melted and precipitation fell. There was kind of a difficulty in determining the extent of the flooding ahead of time, which is why a lot of communities were underprepared. And when the forecast became clear at that point, people had lost power. Towns had a difficult time getting information out about what and when rivers would rise and where. And that just created a recipe for disaster that hydrologists and climatologists think could happen more frequently into the future with climate change. And then along the coast, again, if you think about Maine's position, southeasterly winds bring all of the heavy waves that are coming in from the Gulf of Maine and the ocean and slams them on shore. So there are 20 to 30 foot waves cresting in the build up to the January floods, and pair that with, again, astronomical high tides and sea level rise, and it just creates this triple-headed monster that increases, and in this case, in the coast that winter, the highest flood surge that the state had ever seen. So in talking with leaders about why those storms were especially disastrous in Maine, I heard some common threads. Maine decision makers and residents just had a hard time conceptualizing the magnitude and speed of the December flooding because of how long it had been since they'd seen anything like it. I heard a lot of officials trying to compare what it would have been like with the 1987 April Fool's Day flood. And in the places that had flooded during this event, they had just never seen it before. They weren't able to understand where the river would rise in that instance. And because of that, didn't know where to send resources or whose door to knock on or where to put evacuation notices. And even though the National Weather Service tried to update their forecasts as rapidly as they could, that doesn't mean the information reached decision makers in time for them to act on it. I think two really poignant examples that I found in my reporting about how that lack of preparedness can make or break a town's reaction comes between Farmington and Norridgewock. Farmington on the Sandy River and then Norridgewock on the confluence of the Sandy River and the Kennebec River. Because of flooding that occurred earlier that year in May, the Farmington Fire Chief knew that the department would be cut off from the west bank of the Sandy River. So Farmington sits here, Sandy's there, West Farmington's over here. And the chief knew that if the river would rise as quickly and as intensely as it did in May, that the fire department wouldn't be able to send resources to the other side of town. That's where the high school is. And they thought ahead by placing a fire truck there with a crew and supplies on the west bank of the river to account for that. So they were able to reach people who needed to be rescued or able to distribute supplies where necessary. But down at the confluence of the Sandy, so further downriver where it meets the Kennebec, Norridgewock firefighters saw flooding in neighborhoods that they had never seen before. So although they were able to warn most at-risk residents by door knocking and putting out emergency alerts, they also got an unexpected phone call from a couple whose house was halfway underwater. Unlike much of the region at that point, I think around 450,000 people lost power during that December event. The couple still had power and cell service. So the firefighters said they wouldn't have thought to search that area without receiving that phone call. And one of them told me, we never expected that to flood because we had never seen it. And even the fire chief, who had been around town and kind of working for the fire department on and off for the past 30, 40 years, said it was just inconceivable. So that rapid rise of inland Maine waterways meant emergency managers were often having to play catch up. And emergency managers in Maine, towns have to have one, but oftentimes they're the town clerk, the town manager, they're wearing multiple hats. They're the fire chief. They're not always in tune with the most up-to-date measures of kind of evacuations or just dealing with volatile floods like that. So even when they have information, they can only do so much with it if cell service is down, power is out, and areas are difficult to reach. Pair that with just the amount of infrastructure that's at risk, the amount Maine has built in floodplains and along the coast. Over the next 30 years, there's projection that 2,300 inland road culverts have a chance of overtopping, and culverts are those metal tube structures that go underneath or even over roads that send out water when flooding occurs. And oftentimes in these December events, those culverts would fail and the roads underneath them, or the roads on top of them, would just completely collapse. So 2,300 of those kind of have this risk of overtopping in flood events down the line. And then on the coast, 11 critical infrastructure sites will be at risk of biweekly and high tide flooding by 2050. That's not considering kind of the regular flood risk that exists when large storms or astronomical high tides hit already. And analysis from this very university found that between 28 and 57% of Maine saltwater marshes could be gone by the end of the century. And those saltwater marshes are crucial to slowing down storms before they hit the coast, slowing waves, kind of just absorbing that intensity and acting as more of a shield than hard infrastructure like seawalls or other concrete infrastructure would be able to. So that comes with public infrastructure risks, also comes residential risks. I've been covering home insurance industry and flood insurance industry in Maine for the past year and a half, and some of the stats are just kind of truly astounding. Just about 1% of Maine property owners have flood insurance. So that's different from homeowners insurance, whereas, you know, if your home gets damaged by heavy winds or a tree falls on it, home insurance might be able to kick in. But if your home floods and you do not have flood insurance, which is purchased through this federal program, then you're out of luck. Only 1% of Maine property owners have that. And I mean, 7,000 out of 600,000 is just an intense number to think about. On top of that, only 15 Maine communities are enrolled in a program that actually lowers flood insurance rates. So it's been something that the state has been a little slow to adapt. If more communities kind of take this proactive way of talking to their residents and informing them about the benefits of enrolling in flood insurance, then there is this program organized by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that brings down flood insurance rates for everyone. And then without all of that support through flood insurance and these other backstops, I mean, it just kind of intensifies the amount and the cost of the damage when storms like last year's hit. Not only are you dealing with public infrastructure that's damaged, but you're also dealing with individual homeowners who don't have any other way of kind of rebuilding or of thinking about how to maybe harden their homes against future flood risks. And this is just a quick overview of the aftermath of both of those storms. This December storm, 4 people died, over 200 homes were damaged, and $20 million worth of damage to public infrastructure. And January, the storms were even more costly, 70 million plus, more than 250 homes. So this is a chart I made in December that shows the amount of estimated damage by county. So not only is it county governments who are going to FEMA with these damage estimates, it's also all of the municipalities within them. So they give FEMA an estimate of how much in damage their roads, their water infrastructure, whatever it might be, took. And FEMA provides a certain percentage of reimbursement, about 75%, and then the state kind of helps the rest. And with this, you can see where it was hardest hit. I mean, Franklin County and Oxford County really bore the brunt of that storm. So what's changed since then? My reporting has really focused on the wake-up call that a lot of town managers, select board members, elected or unelected town officials have felt since those storms hit. I mean, even in Western Maine and some of the more rural and conservative parts of the state, I'm hearing directly from officials saying that these events are becoming more frequent, and because of that, we have to do something. I'm not necessarily phrasing it as climate change, but there is this overall understanding, regardless of ideology, that they need to protect their residents from future disasters like these happening again. So it's really sparked, I think, an overall pretty impressive amount of action. Towns are purchasing new emergency management equipment. They're trying to roll out more sophisticated alert systems. A lot of the scariest and most damaging situations that arose during the December floods came because there's just this inability to communicate to town residents. They're doing better at pursuing state and federal funds for climate resilient infrastructure. I mean, again, you're having people who are managing elections every year, keeping track of the budget, going to town meetings every night, also having to apply for very complicated federal grants, state grants to get the money they need to rebuild their water main, which could fall into the river if there isn't enough infrastructure built into it. They're also starting to consider ordinances to limit development and rebuilding in vulnerable floodplains. I've heard from a number of people as well that after the December floods, they saw occasionally people just rebuilding in the exact same spot along the Kennebec River that was damaged. What do we think will happen during the next flood? It's kind of this kick the can down the road, flood amnesia effect that some communities go through if they haven't really felt the effects of the flood or haven't been able to conceptualize how frequently floods like these will occur down the line with climate change and more frequent inundation and heavier inundation events. So I thought Norwich Walk in of itself is this great example. I spent a lot of time there reporting, and they were in a particularly dire situation, as I kind of described earlier, during the December floods, with their fire department also having to do water rescues. At the same time, they have this bridge that's a state route that runs right through town that was nearly up to the concrete, the truss that runs over in water from the Kennebec River. It flooded that much. And that bridge was also kind of the pinpoint for communities up north, Carrabassett Valley, elsewhere, to evacuate south through the state from their own flooding issues. So it became this vital area to cross the Kennebec River and make it down and out through southern Maine. But at a certain point in time during the flooding on December 19th, the bridge started to sway. The town manager and fire chief were standing on top of it, wondering if we should close the bridge, call the state, have someone take a look at it. But they just were at a loss of what to do because they were just in a situation where they had never even thought of. So they've taken that as a serious wake-up call and have done a lot since then. They are in the process of working on 2 bank stabilization projects along the Sandy River. Estimated cost of $475,000. They got a $1 million state grant to strengthen the town's water main against flooding. They enrolled a new emergency text alert system and electronic signage to help with the notification process for floods, and they're looking to get a new swiftwater rescue boat because the one I mentioned earlier when they were able to do that rescue, that only came because they partnered with a neighboring town. So they were able to borrow their boat that time, but the next time something like that happens, they want to be sure that they have their own. And then at the regional level, each county has an emergency management agency. How much they staff and fund that agency varies from county to county. Franklin County has 2 county emergency management agency employees, and they are in a particularly tense situation just with the flooding that they've seen over the past few years. So they're starting to exercise their municipal emergency action plans more and more, especially after last December. They're bringing together all the municipalities of the county and having them do these kind of role-playing simulations of, okay, there is a hurricane that is hitting Farmington during the same week as the county fair. How are we going to react when this road's closed, and there's no cell phone service? So they're really trying to conceptualize the risks and negative outcomes that they weren't able to during the December storms. Down on the coast in York County, they are starting work in this upcoming year to start stabilizing dunes in towns like Agunquit, Wells, Kennebunk, with a $1 million, maybe even more, dredge that they purchased with some ARPA funds that will restore a lot of the damage that the January storm did to the dunes. I mean, there's this kind of, again, as there is elsewhere in the state, this fear that if those dunes aren't repaired before the next storm, there isn't, last January's storm was disastrous, but the dunes were there then. What will happen if they're not during the next storm is anybody's guess. Communities are really working together too to build resilience in their infrastructure systems like wastewater treatment facilities. And they're starting to take hazard mitigation plans into account. These are things that every county has to put together. It kind of identifies where the weak points of their county infrastructure is and gives them kind of these step-by-step instructions for strengthening them or kind of securing them against climate change and other hazards. So at the state level, after the winter storms of last year, Governor Mills and the legislature approved $60 million in grant for emergency infrastructure repairs. The state has also created the Office of Community Affairs, and it sounds like you all heard from their director, Samantha Horn, not too long ago. So that will help with this regional and local planning aspect for preparing for future floods, coordinating applications for grants with FEMA and other organizations, helping communities even think about how to design a new like wastewater treatment plant or whatever the technical planning that they need to do that. And then this year, we've also, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the passage of landmark legislation to fund home hardening, floodplain planning support, and emergency communication systems. That's LD1 that Governor Janet Mills introduced at the start of the legislative session. The Department of Transportation has also dished out $21 million for damaged wharves and piers to rebuild other key marine infrastructure along the coast. So I know we've already talked about this briefly, but the goal of the Office of Community Affairs is just to make sure that communities are spending more time putting together projects and less time applying for grants. It's such a tedious process that they're just trying to do the best they can to walk communities through the grant application, especially when there's only one person in a town office who's in charge for that grant. Maybe they've never even filled one out before. The Office of Community Affairs really hopes to step in and help with the technical planning for those rural infrastructure projects. There's also an effort to remap and digitize Maine's flood hazard areas. As I've said a bunch of times now, there is still this outdated framework of flood maps throughout the state that haven't really accounted for new risks with climate change and which areas are most vulnerable to future floods. That without having that understanding makes it hard to plan future infrastructure projects, to map escape routes when the time comes for it, and just in general prepare for future floods. And they're also guiding communities on floodplain management and development. Maine, at the state level and definitely at the municipal level, does not have too much guidance in terms of where and when you're allowed to develop in, or what you're allowed to develop in a floodplain. So communities might see a couple homes wiped away from a flood and then see the homeowners rebuild immediately after in the same exact way as the previous house. And there really isn't much that has been done to kind of restructure that and put in some sort of legislation at the local level to guide smarter building that will harden homes against future flooding or move them back away from flood risks. So LD1 creates the State Resilience Office underneath the Office of Community Affairs. That's an office strictly dedicated to climate resilience efforts. It gives $800,000 for MEMA which is the Maine Emergency Management Agency, to update their emergency communications. They're looking into adapting the iPause system, which if you've ever gotten an Amber Alert on your phone or anything like that, is what the federal government kind of harnesses to send out alerts, and they're looking to allow state and local communities to send similar warnings through cell phones, regardless of carriers, when a flood strikes and evacuation orders need to be sent out. There is also an $11 million dedicated to match federal funds for local resilience projects, a $15 million fund for homeowners to use to either, I believe, secure their roofs against heavy wind events, which also tend to accompany these really intense storms, and flood-proof their homes as well. It also, along with the previous measure I mentioned, modernizes the state flood risk mapping system with $5 million and funds several positions in MEMA to help the State Resilience Office kind of coordinate efforts with rural municipalities. There's this general goal that the director, Samantha Horn, described to me, it's just that when rural communities call for help, they want to be sure that they answer the phone right away. So there's also been the Maine Community Resilience Partnership, which has been ongoing since 2021. It's located underneath the Governor's Office for Policy Innovation in the Future. It's given over $9 million to 100 communities since inception. That includes a big chunk of money to Blue Hill for its upgrades to its wastewater treatment facility. GIS is working on developing a resiliency plan to coordinate a bunch of different resiliency projects. And then they're up in Fort Kent, they're taking kind of the first steps about thinking how residents are burdened by increased rainfall and their ability to kind of send away storm runoff. So all of these efforts are being done sort of under a day-to-day understanding of how federal partners may be involved. A lot of resilience projects in Maine are backed by the federal government in one way or another. It could be through FEMA, giving out disaster funds for communities just to rebuild. And then there's also the more proactive grants that communities are after to kind of take into account flood risks before they happen. LD1 in and of itself hinges on $69 million NOAA grant, as does this initiative out of Wells to train municipal officials on resilience work. And in general, Maine has been the target for this since the start of the Trump administration of cutoffs of federal funding. And that doesn't stop at the university level. It also kind of has this daunting threat to the money that LD1 works out of. From my reporting, I mean, the state officials have told me that the funds set aside for LD1 have been drawn down, meaning the state's actively using it for its resilience projects. And at the moment, they don't have any worries about it, but it's just the kind of thing that they have to think about down the line. FEMA also canceled this resilience in communities program for local resilience projects. So this is one of the most popular FEMA programs to work on those infrastructure projects that towns wouldn't be able to afford without federal funds. The state historically hasn't provided too much funds in that department. So they've really leaned on their federal partners to make that final connection. And with the cancellation of that project, there's already been or the cancellation of that program, there's already been effects in North Haven, which had put together this $400,000 program to restore its waterfront after the January storms. That's halted for however long. I mean, it could be 4 years until that program is restarted. And it also means future disaster assistance isn't guaranteed. So for the working theory for towns, up until this year has been that if a disaster strikes, the federal government will be there to reimburse us to the extent that we need. That is also coming under question, which has really shown why it's important for the state and local communities to kind of take responsibility for these projects and move forward with or without the federal government. Because if they don't take action now, I mean, I think it's what every $1 spent on climate resilience efforts saves $6 in disaster outcomes had those projects not been pursued. So it's just really pertinent to take advantage now while there is still time before the next event. And then on top of that, there's been cutbacks to the National Weather Service. Here at the Gray and Caribou offices, they haven't, the National Weather Service has left unfilled positions vacant. They're not hiring to fill those positions. They're also flying fewer weather balloons, which just means that future forecasts aren't as strong and as frequent as they used to be. I mean, just with the December storm, we saw how crucial it was that the National Weather Service provide that hydraulic modeling and give towns a heads up. And even in that instance, when it all happened very late on, I mean, imagine if it happened not at all, if there wasn't that warning that ultimately went out to communities to get away from riverbanks and flood potential areas. So in speaking with a lot of experts, both inside and outside of the state, there are many, many measures that are still left for the state to pursue. At the ground level, there needs to be more emergency management experts to help towns kind of pursue these projects and stay focused. And when disaster comes, lead the response to evacuate or help people where necessary. Right now, emergency managers at the county and local level often aren't grounded in municipal budgets. They take advantage of state or federal grants, which means it's kind of a year-to-year basis about whether the position will be funded. And they need more certainty than that to act effectively. We've spoken a little bit about model floodplain ordinances, but in order to reduce risks in floodplains, you need to have an understanding of kind of what development's going on there to begin with and how to manage that into the future. The state is working on, this is kind of a pie in the sky idea right now that hasn't been put into action yet, but a disaster and risk information center that has those flood maps, other tools that communities can just go online to find and create their own resilience planning through it. And right now on the table in the legislature, I think it's still in the committee phase, is a bill from a York County state legislator that would put it up to Maine voters to decide on whether to approve a $75 million bond for resilience projects. So with that money, it could fill the gap that the federal government is leaving right now, and kind of have the state secure its own funds to take resilience projects and at the state and local level to the next step. All right, with that, happy to take questions, I think.
Sure. First, everyone, can we clap again in terms of how much we learned from this well-organized, in-depth presentation about one of the most important things going on in Maine. It was great to hear your different roles that you've had as you moved along in your career. And just to get us started in terms of thinking about, because I'm sure there are lots of people saying, I want to be him. I want to figure this out. And so just majors in journalism or majors in other areas like oceanic things, in management. What are your thoughts? Because you have this amazing sort of broad experience in seeing things, and you're here at the university giving a talk. What should students, undergraduates and graduate students, be thinking about in terms of um, majors and careers that would help the state and help them?
Like journalism, I think something I've heard a lot from state and local officials that there's a need for is like more emergency managers. And that comes through degrees in emergency management specifically, which on its face sounds kind of, I don't know, daunting, but also boring. It's a lot of administrative work, but then when the time comes, it's kind of like the most important thing you can have. It's someone who's answering the phone, dispatching resources where they're necessary. That's something that I've been thinking about more. Like it's something that I might have considered as an undergrad because I think journalism is impactful in kind of addressing these issues, but I think that probably is one of the most direct ways to make an impact for local communities against, or at least building resilience and kind of securing their futures against flooding. That's been something I've been thinking about a little bit, I guess. Never been too much of I was always more of a social sciences person. So on the science side of things, I understand the importance. I've always liked to write and communicate. So I know science does that, but I was not really able to write as freely as I would have liked to in journalism. So whatever is in a writing intensive major, I mean, you can still do a lot with that after graduating.
Yeah. And are there emergency management degree opportunities in Maine?
Yeah, I think at the University of Maine Augusta has a program, and then I think the University of New England just started one online. I'm not sure. I don't have too much information about that one. I've tried to look into it, but had difficulties.
Great.
Getting to it.
One of the things that was really great, I mean, you had wonderful slides. They were just really very helpful. Your Jay's oyster photo,
Oh, yeah.
one of the ones in Portland.
Yeah.
That area right near it, if you walk just a few steps from where your picture was taken, they've set up an interesting signage that shows how high the highest flood was there at that location. And it's kind of asking people to think about that.
Yeah.
And do other parts too in fairly near there in Portland, as you walk, you'll see just some interesting ways that people have put signage. And Belfast has similar things like that too, showing how high the highest has been. What are your thoughts as a reporter in terms of that as a part of the step to put out some of these messages? Do you think, how would we know kind of how they're working, and what are your thoughts about them?
No, I mean, I live in Portland and have gone up and down Commercial Street a number of times. I haven't noticed that. I'll have to check it out. No, I think anything really that helps you put into perspective how bad a flood event was and how bad it could be in the future is helpful. I mean, it just kind of puts that risk into this more personable and identifiable relationship to your life, which without that is kind of, there's no way to inspire action or motivation and political leaders or local officials. So I think that's a great. I mean, it's kind of the same with journalism. I mean, you're kind of just trying to put in perspective these issues and how they impact people directly. I mean, for my reporting, I spoke with one woman who lives along the Kennebec River in Norwich Walk, and everything that the town officials felt they had lapses in during that flood event, she felt the direct repercussions of. She didn't know where to evacuate to. She didn't know when to evacuate. She didn't know which road was safe to go down, and had no way of figuring it out. Her power was out and her phone line was down, and she had 4 dogs that she was shuffling from, the icy water in her house out to her car, and just had nowhere to go. Luckily, she was ultimately able to stay with her daughters. But it's just that kind of thing that as humans, you have to hear other people's story and think about, wow, what would I do in that situation? If that was one of my grandparents, how I would have helped them in that situation. And I think, putting it physically and visually in front of you is a good way of doing that.
And mentioning your grandparents, is a group in Maine that is very focused. They call themselves the Brain Trust, and they're really interested in how we make sure that what we're doing really works for elders throughout Maine, because Maine is, as we all know, and we're all lucky about this, but it's one of the oldest states in terms of median age. And do you have thoughts about any of that in terms of sort of what people might do um, if they're, thinking about different ages?
Hey, Linda, I hate to cut you off, but could I squeeze in one question from
Oh,
here?
absolutely. My apologies.
No need.
Okay, I'm just curious, of the 15 communities, are most of them in Oxford or Franklin County, or is it, I would assume like Cumberland has a lot of funding in terms of like the 15 communities that are enrolled in the federal program?
Oh, yeah. Man, I'd have to look at that. No, definitely in Cumberland County. I can't think of them off the top of my head. It's places you wouldn't expect. I mean, like Wells, for example, the place where that has the most flood insurance claims than anywhere else in the state. I've looked at the FEMA data. They did not participate in it's called the community rating system. They are not an active participant in it, which means that their residents do not have access to reduced flood insurance costs. And they're the ones paying out the most claims. So you would think it would make sense for them to be a part of it. At least last I checked, they were not. So, and it used to, I mean, it's gone down. This is the surprising part. It was at 17 a few years ago. Now it's down to 15. I think there's true action on the state level to do something about that. But as of right now, it's kind of surprisingly low.
So I think we're at the point where we're supposed to wrap up at 4. If there are people in the room that have any questions, feel free to come on up. Linda, if you see people in the chat that still have stuff, we can help them get connected to Emmet. And let's thank him one last time for really great.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate